Hello and welcome again to another edition of the Leader Campus Talks. And I'm with Nicole Lipkin. Should I call you doctor?
You can call me Nicole.
Okay. Nicole, who has a psychology degree as a doctorate in psychology and an MBA. So that's kind of an unusual combination. Why? Well, first thing, you've gotten a new book out, so why don't you give that a plug here?
Sure. It's a little old now. Came out in 2013, but it's what keeps leaders up at night, recognizing and resolving your most troubling management issues. It's kind of
Okay.
about the neuroscience and psychology behind leadership snafus, the things we all struggle with.
Yeah. Uh, that leads to maybe my first question then, that is there things that keep leaders up at night that are the same as managers that keep them up at night? Or do you see a difference between the two, leadership and management?
Well, I mean, I definitely see a difference between leadership and management. That's like the age-old argument, right? But I think the thing, when we actually think about it, obviously financials, market pressures, all of that keep people up at night. But what I really think for a lot of times that ends up being like the most nagging things, or the things we complain to our partners about or friends about, the things that really nag at us are interpersonal things.
Okay.
Things that we might have with coworkers or direct reports, or snafus or mistakes that we make that we wish we didn't. The things that we kind of ruminate over and over in our heads tend to be interpersonal related things. So that's what the book was about, and at least that's kind of when I'm working with businesses, what we focus on.
So does that change the approach? What type of approach then do you have for people who are I noticed that you called developing leadership and then young talent and emerging leadership. So are there different ways of approaching, or what are the different ways of approaching? Because I hate to use a yes, no question. What are different ways of approaching these types of people, developing leaders, young talent, and emerging leaders?
Well, I think, everyone comes to the table with different strengths, different weaknesses, different areas they're looking to develop. So it really, first of all, very much depends on the leadership team we're working with, or the individual that we're working with. However, when you're talking about emerging leaders versus young talent, I think one of the challenges in organizations now with young talent is developing certain professional skills related to professionalism. And when someone new is entering, or young is entering a career, it's like all the things when we were in our 20s trying to figure out and navigate, how do I approach the workplace? How do I approach my career? So when you're working with young talent, or when we're working with young talent, that's what we focus on. How do I approach my career? How do I want to show up as a professional? How do I fit into the culture, advocate for myself, align? Versus emerging leaders, that might be, that I don't think that has to do with any age group. That has to do across all different types of people at different times of their career when they're kind of emerging as a leader. So I think all different versus executive leadership or director level leadership. Some might be dealing with similar problems. Some might be dealing with different problems. So we really target to the individual.
And you were talking mostly about interpersonal problems then. So how does such a varied way of handling interpersonal problems in particular, what do you find common amongst a lot of the interpersonal problems?
Well, and I guess I should clarify that. Because, I mean, I think that, there's two things. People, when it comes to interpersonal issues or struggles or challenges or opportunities, it really depends on how we are and how we impact other people. So I think when it comes to that, it's helping people recognize, it's develop a level of self-awareness to recognize your own footprint, your own impact on others and yourself and your career. However, when I think I use the wrong term. It expands beyond. I was just talking more about the things that nag at us tend to be how we show up and how we impact others, or how others impact us.
Okay. What do you think are the biggest mistakes that are made by then leaders in this kind of approach or this kind of situation?
Man, I mean, they vary, but I think that, when they vary a lot, but I think when it comes down to it, at least in the work that I've done, in my own personal experiences as an entrepreneur, as a business owner, as an executive coach, and working with people at all different levels, from C-suite to entrepreneurs, I would say that there's three common universal derailers that get us all throughout regardless of how old we are, or what position we have. The first is being too busy to win, which is very self-explanatory. And I think we all struggle with that, either on a daily basis or at least at periods during our lives. The second is being too afraid to lose, which has to do with our mindset. How we approach problems. Are we kind of closed off to our own abilities in how we approach problems? Do we have a fixed mindset? Do we have a growth mindset? Are we able to tackle things, or at least be comfortable with failure or the many attempts it might take? And the third, which is a huge one, which again is very universal. I don't care who you are, what industry you work on, which is about being too proud to see, which is the human, as human beings, our resistance to change. Okay. Our brains are designed to resist change and to kind of go with the status quo. So we're already designed that way. And when you put a bunch of people in a room that are resistant to change, that are designed to be, it takes a lot of energy to look at things differently. But we know some big companies have crashed because of that.
Are there a few easy suggestions? I mean, I don't want to spoil the books or anything, but are there a few easy suggestions that you could make to the campus members here as to how to overcome some of that fear of change? Because we have on the campus discussion list already a person, his name escapes me now, who wrote about the idea of fear, how fear plays into it, or she wrote about how fear plays into the idea. So what kind of techniques can we use to maybe overcome some of this fear?
Right. Well, I think even before fear comes a self-awareness of the psychological, of first of all, how your brain works, and also of your natural, innate psychological biases that are going to emerge. Because ultimately fear is second, right? The emotional response to your biases is second. Yeah. So first and foremost is a self-awareness about these psychological biases, knowing kind of how your brain and how your psychology works with these biases. So when I say that, for example, loss aversion, and I can send you some articles around this, loss aversion or sunk cost bias or status quo, whatever it might be that, that we will, the more we invest our time, money, and effort into a person, place, or thing, a hire or a project, even if it's a bad hire or even if it's a bad project, if we did it and we owned that, the more money, time, and effort we're going to place into that thing. So these basic things that we know from behavioral economics, the more we understand this, the more we can counteract it. So I think step one is understanding our natural biases. I think as leaders, we all need to be responsible for understanding what happens on teams with that and what happens in ourselves. Second of all, I think when you're working, when you're faced with something where you have to change, I think forcing yourself to identify a different way of doing something, even if it's absolutely ridiculous. But if you start practicing different ways to do, even in your brain, thinking about it, you're starting to flex that muscle of being more adaptable. Again, this is all practice. Or if we're on a team working with other people, forcing people to come up with ideas that probably wouldn't even happen, but forcing the team to be more adaptable. Discussing pros and cons out loud with someone else that can listen objectively, where you might be immersed in something, but someone else might not be. That is one of the most powerful tools we have. I mean, there's a bunch. It's in my book. It's in some blogs. But there's a bunch of ways that we can tackle this resistance to change.
And when you take a look at resistance to change, how does the idea of us versus them feed into that? Because that's also part of the natural way that your brain is functioning, is us versus them.
Of course. And us versus them is actually a very interesting concept. And it's, this is one of my favorite things to work with teams on, because when you understand it, then you can counteract it. It's, again, all comes down to self-awareness. But us versus them, this psychological concept, right? This thing that happens just so naturally, like that, I might see another woman with brown hair, just these basic random things that we associate ourselves with. And all of a sudden we have a bond, even if it's subconscious, we have a bond. You might see another man with a purple tie. immediately there's a bond. That's why sports fans get so like intense.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden that bond makes you very powerful against the them group. So understanding that this is happening helps you break things down. But when it comes to change, it can be a very difficult and problematic issue, because it makes the resistance even stronger, because all of a sudden you're battling an enemy or a perceived enemy that you've made up in your head. So again, having objective, either an objective facilitator pointing this out, or someone in the team being responsible for taking kind of that objective point of view, like, hey, this is the direction we're going, like naysaying the direction people, or shifting people in the direction they're going.
This has bothered me for quite some time. And it's a question I didn't add on the previews and anything, but being a woman and also a psychologist, where this has bothered me for some time, ever since the Nita Hill things back in the early 90s. Where does it come from, do you think, this idea of men and power over women, and the ability to do so many terrible things as sexual harassment and sexual assault even, and where does that come from? It's all the power position, I know, but why is that so hard, it seems, for men to control, I guess?
That's a loaded question.
Yeah.
Probably will take longer to answer. And I don't have all the answers.
Yeah.
But you're talking, power is very difficult for people to deal with. Very, very difficult. And some people deal with it gracefully, and some people don't deal with it well. And I wouldn't just put it in the category of men. Women don't deal with power. Women, it's difficult for men and women. However, the people that are, and this is a very broad statement, so I want to be careful in saying this.
Yeah.
But it's more than just power. For the people that are crossing the line when it comes to sexual harassment or sexual assault, when someone crosses the line and acts out on their sexual desires against someone's will, that's more than power. There's other things at play. There's other psychology at play, and that's why I'm saying this is a longer, more in-depth discussion.
I'm sorry about that.
No, but it's an important discussion, and I'm so glad, I'm so happy that this is being talked about, and that this is coming out. It gives people a place to speak out about it. Finally, it gives people in their careers where, I remember when I first started out my career, that these conversations were not talked about. And so it's giving people a platform to protect themselves, to speak out, to feel comfortable that it is okay to speak out. So it's such an important conversation on both sides, for men and women. But I do, again, power is one component of it, but there's a lot more psychology behind that.
What do you think leaders should do to attempt to write this out? I mean, to try to prevent it from occurring within their own organizations, whether it be political or whether it be private enterprise?
That's a good question. Look, I don't think this is something that is ever going to be eradicated completely. This is just like we're never going to eradicate crime completely, or eradicate people not being nice to other people completely. However, the more emotionally supportive, and I hate to be all shrinky here, but the more emotionally supportive of an environment that you create as a leader, the more you open up dialogue, the more you allow for people to make mistakes and to be able to come clean about them and talk about them, and rather than being like, you messed up, and just provide like, okay, how can we do better? Again, the more of an emotionally supportive environment that you create, the more people are likely to speak out and respect one another. So it's about how you show up, because ultimately, as we know, leaders are very much part of creating the culture, if not the main part of creating a culture that trickles down. And they give the go-ahead of whether it's going to be a really positive, healthy, emotionally supportive culture, or a really crappy culture, right? So I think understanding the power that a leader has as yourself, understanding that you are part of shaping this community, is where folks have to start, recognizing their own power in that, and then deciding, hey, what kind of community do I want? Do I want one that's open and communicative and supportive, or do I want one where people really are afraid to speak up and don't like one another, or are afraid to kind of communicate about these things? So it's not only changed with, talking about sexuality in the workplace, it's changed with politics. Years ago, we didn't talk about anything, but nowadays leaders are faced with the challenge where people are talking about politics in the workplace, and you can't just shut it down and ignore it. It's happening. So things are changing, things are evolving. And I think the more we understand that we can really shape the kind of emotional footprint that we want to have of our cultures, the better. It's awesome, actually. It's wonderful that we're becoming more communicative.
And that sets up a feeling of safety.
Yes.
So if the feeling within the country, you might say, is feeling safer, will that impact the feeling of the businesses and the politicians? I mean, if people 100%. In general.
100%. I mean, we know the research on psychological safety is really fascinating. I mean, we know that I think Google did a study within the past couple of years looking at kind of what are the important dynamics that make a team successful versus a team not successful. And that, they found different factors, but one of the most important factors, one of the primary factors, was psychological safety. And it makes sense. When people feel psychologically and emotionally safe with one another, they're more willing to call each other out on things that are uncomfortable. They're more willing to, again, fight resistance to change. They're more willing to do these things that we need to do to be successful. That applies to teams. That applies to cultures. And if we all work towards that, I mean, the bottom line is, if you want to apply a dollar amount to it, some people only want to think about that, and that's fine. You can. The more psychologically safe people feel, the more willing they are to take the risks that you need them to take, the more engaged they are. And bottom line, we know positive engagement is associated with positive profit or positive increased bottom line.
You're a fascinating person to talk with. I'm very honored that you joined our group.
Thank you. I'm honored for you inviting me.
And I appreciate it, and give you a chance to plug your book again, please.
Sure. So it's What Keeps Leaders Up at Night, recognizing and resolving your most troubling management issues. And it's, can be purchased anywhere. So thank you very much.
Nicole Lipkin, thanks so much for being on the campus here, and I appreciate the time and the effort, and I hope we can stay in touch. It'd be nice to bring you back maybe in a year or so and see how much change there's been in that year, especially with the last question that bothers me so much about that. So, and how leaders are impacting that time of safety.
Yeah. Thanks, Mel. I really appreciate you having me here.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.